Hi! Today I will show you how to sew the Vega dress. For this dress, the best fabric in my opinion is a heavy crepe or medium weight crepe. Look at the characteristic crepe weave here. We are looking for a fabric that has a lot of body and voluminous drape. If it is too light or slippery, it will show lines of undergarments, especially in plain colors, and the back tie will not hold itself properly. You can also try a medium weight linen or cotton poplin, for example. You will also want to avoid see-through fabrics, because this is not a dress I would advise to line because of the pleats in the back and the tie. It's difficult to line. Look at this green fabric here. It's a triple crepe I bought from Minerva, and as you can see, it has a lot of body, so the tie is pretty. On the contrary, on this pink fabric I had in my stash, which is more lightweight and flimsy, the tie doesn't hang very nicely. Here you can see a picture of the problem. Now, before sewing, I advise you to wash and let your fabric dry in the same way you will care for your finished garment. This will help to avoid any shrinkage. Then press the fabric, fold it lengthwise and cut the pattern pieces. If you are using the PDF pattern, please click on the link in the top corner of this video if you need any help to print or use the pattern. First, interface all facings. I also advise to interface the tie with a very lightweight interfacing if your fabric doesn't have enough body. I also serged the inner edges of each neckline facing to finish them. You can finish them in any other way if you wish, and depending on the possibilities of your sewing machine. Now, if you know me, you know I love silk organza to stabilize necklines cut in the bias. If you don't have silk organza, you can use a strip of interfacing or just sew a row of straight stitches with your machine within the seam allowance. This will already help. And this is really an important step, especially when working with a crepe like this, because on a V neckline, it will very easily stretch out of shape, and once it does, it is impossible to fix. So if you want to do like me, you just take a thin strip of silk organza and you can stitch it within the seam allowance on the wrong side of your piece. Otherwise, just machine stitch within the seam allowance. Then let's pin side front to front center. So I just pin side front to front at side front edges, with right sides together matching notches. Stitch easing front to fit. I also advise to stabilize this part here. Sorry, I didn't show it in the video, but in between markings on center front piece, it's really better if you also do a row of machine stitch to prevent it from stretching out of shape. Then you can stitch, serge and press these seams towards the outsides. And then you can also pin and stitch the side seam of the dress on the side opposite to the zipper. So you can just pin from armhole to hem, stitch and serge. Now let's take the tie. So pin two tie sections with right sides together. If the fabric is too lightweight or flimsy, I advise to interface one of these pieces. Otherwise, just take two tie sections with right sides together and you will leave the short end seam allowance free. So this straight end. And here you can pin all around the section, leaving the short end free. Once you have pinned, you can stitch and then you can trim seam allowance all around the section, leaving this edge free. At the tip, trim as close as possible to the stitching to get a nice sharp tip. Then you can turn seam allowance and press it towards the wrong side on both sides of your tie. So press it towards wrong side like this. And then turn right side out. Press. And then finish the short end by hand stitching. Repeat on the other side. Then let's fold one back piece along fold line with wrong sides together. The fold line is where the tie will be attached. So fold your piece, press it along this line, and then lap short end of tie just 3 millimeters over fold edge of back. As you can see here, pin and edge stitch in place. Like this. Repeat on the other side. This is how it looks on the wrong side. But it won't show at all as it will be tied. Now let's make center back seam. Serge center back edge on both back sections, or you can also finish with a bias tape if you prefer. And then, with right sides together, pin both back pieces together along center back seam from circle notch to hem. Then press seam open. Now, let's take the facings. So first take the back facing and with right sides together, pin center back seam from lower edge to circle. Trim seam allowance and press the seam open. Then, with right sides together, you can pin back facing to front facing on the side opposite to the zipper. And in the same way, you can stitch and press the seam open after trimming the seam allowance. Be careful, on this video I was making a prototype, so sorry about this, I stitched on both sides of facing. But of course, here we will have a zipper, so you will only stitch one side, the side opposite to the zipper. Now you can pin facing to neck and armhole edges with right sides together, matching notches, centers, side seams, and having pressed under the seam allowance on facings at shoulders. Then you can trim about half of seam allowance, and be careful, I leave the shoulders free. I'm not touching them now. To get a perfect V-neck, you can clip inward corner of front V neckline as close as possible to the stitching. Now let's understitch. This is used to help prevent the facing from rolling to the outside of the dress when you're wearing the dress. So to do this, you press the seam allowance with the facing. So the seam needs to be very flat, and you will stitch here as close as possible to the seam, catching both the seam allowance and the facing. So here I'm catching my seam allowance and the facing and stitching as close as possible to the seam. Then you can turn right side out. Now we can finish the shoulders. So, pin front to back of dress at shoulders, keeping the facings free. So keep them out of the way with your fingers and pin front to back, only the dress, then stitch. Once you're done, finger press this shoulder seam allowances open. Turn under the seam allowances of the facing. With your fingers again. And then slip stitch facing edges together. And then you can press. This is how you will get an invisible finish. Here I will not be showing the detail of inserting a zipper. If you need a video about this, you can find one on frenchpoetry.com on the help and tutorial page. But what I will show is how to finish the zipper. So here, fold the zipper over the seam allowance towards wrong side of the dress. And then fold the seam allowance of the facing. You can press that seam allowance towards the wrong side of the facing. And pin it as close as possible to the zipper, making sure fabric is not too close and can't get caught by zipper teeth. And then hand stitch in place. Do the same on the other side of the zipper. Now let's take hem facings. So take both back hem facing sections with right side together. You can pin them at center back seam and stitch. And then you can pin back facing to front facing at sides, stitch and press all these 3 seams open. Then you can press about 1 centimeter of the upper edge of the facing. Then pin the facing in place on the dress, matching seams, and stitch at the bottom. Then you can trim the seam allowance and understitch the same way we did for the neckline facing. And then you can make your hem either by machine or by hand with an invisible hem stitch. Here I pressed my hem and I will do it with a machine stitch. So as you can see, I'm using a stitch with a zigzag. The last step is to catch stitch the facing to the seam allowance at the side opposite to the zipper and also at center back seam to prevent it from rolling outside of the dress. So here you can catch stitch. And voila, your dress is finished. I hope you like it and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on French poetry. You can post your makes on Instagram with hashtags FPVega and French Poetry Patterns. See you soon on French Poetry!